Good morning and welcome to Fast Forward Diversity and Inclusion. I'm Isa Buencamino and my co-host is Hannah Wilson. And today we'll be hosting our webcast, the ninth in the series of 12 interviews. So Fast Forward Diversity and Inclusion is a webcast series where we invite leading advocates who've been working on this agenda for years to share their thoughts, insights, and experience. Hannah and I, our purpose in hosting these conversations is to fast forward our D&I orientation, allowing us all to build from what's already been achieved and learned and to take the agenda to new heights. We invite a diversity of guests representing the protected characteristics, people from all walks of life from the UK and other countries, because Hannah and I believe that stretching our D&I orientation to a more global perspective enhances our ability to empathize and understand the lived experiences of others, to do something personally about it in a meaningful way.
And today we are delighted to be joined by Shaun Dellenty. Shaun is the author of a book by Bloomsbury called Celebrating Difference, A Whole School Approach to LGBT plus Inclusion. He's an ex-primary school teacher who's now an independent LGBT plus inclusion education consultant and trainer. A few years ago, he was named as one of the 100 most influential LGBT plus figures by The Independent on Sunday and one of the 100 global diversity leaders of 2020. In 2016, he was designated as a point of light by the UK Prime Minister. Wow, Shaun, what accolades you've achieved already in your career to date. So we are absolutely delighted to have you here. Welcome to the show. Our first question, Shaun, is always the same to everybody. Okay, so the first question is, how did you become a champion for diversity and inclusion? How did it all begin?
Okay, well, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for having me on the show and for that lovely introduction. How did it start? Well, to be honest with you, I've been in education since 1992, and in 2009, I was working as a school leader and as a class teacher part-time as well, and I was marking books and planning and assessing and doing all of those things that you do when you work in a school, and I thought that was going to be my life and my career. And then suddenly, out of the blue, something happened that changed everything. We did, just before Christmas 2009-10, some student questionnaires, surveys around bullying. And when we got them back and crunched the data, we discovered to our horror that in our London primary school, elementary school, that 75% of our students were experiencing homophobic bullying on a daily basis in and around the school, whether or not they identified as LGBT+. Now, as a school leader, I was horrified by that. I'd actually been bullied myself as a young gay man to the point where I became almost suicidal and actually walked out of the UK education system as a result. So I knew that that wasn't going to happen to the amazing young people in our care. So to cut a long story short, I contacted a number of LGBT plus training organizations and said, do you do training for primary schools? To which they said, no, we do secondary. But you can't do it in primary schools because you'll end up in the Daily Mail, or parents will complain, or some people of faith might complain because they'll see that you have some sort of LGBT plus agenda. And actually my agenda and our agenda was about keeping children safe and preventing suffering. And had we ignored that data, we would have been negligent in our duty of care. So over that Christmas, I wrote a training program called Inclusion for All to help tackle, but more importantly, prevent prejudice-related bullying of all kinds, but in particular LGBT+, because that was our specific problem. And I delivered it first in our London primary school. It was very successful. So then I started ringing other schools in Southwark, which was the borough that I worked. It rippled out across London, and I found myself working in other London boroughs. And very soon I found myself working across the entire UK. And now I travel around the world delivering it. So that's it in a nutshell, really. It was a reaction and a response to a problem.
Thanks, Shaun. There's so much there that Isa and I want to tease out and unpack, but I just want to zoom into the Daily Mail. I had a bit of a falling out with the Daily Mail as a head teacher doing this work in my school in South Oxfordshire. And I'm just wondering about the relationship between schools and their commitment to the diversity, equity and inclusion journey and the fear perhaps of that retribution in the mainstream media. Because when you read the comments in the regional papers and also the national tabloids about D&I work, it really reveals perhaps the state of play in the country. Any thoughts on the media's role in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, in the majority, my work, for whatever reason, was received in the majority fairly well. But obviously then, as you say, you go to the comments column and you start to read it, and that's where it's revealed. But when it's revealed in the comments column, that to me provides the rationale for doing the work in the first place. And it was interesting because when I started blogging for the Huffington Post and the Guardian, etc., etc., colleagues and friends and parents in the school would come up to me and go, "My goodness me, have you read what people are writing?" And I would say, "I've read a bit of it, but do you know what? I don't need to invest time in reading that and investing emotional energy into that, because I've been hearing this stuff ever since I came onto planet Earth, and I could write it myself. You know, if I had £1 for every time I get called a paedophile, or for having some flag waving agenda, if I had £1 for every time I heard that, I'd have my own private jet." But that to me is not important. What's important is keeping the young people in front of me safe. And from the point of view of being a compassionate manager of people, I want to ensure that everybody feels safe and included in my organization. And that means them being authentic. So to be honest with you, the press can whinge and whine about it all they like. If I, as a compassionate human being, if I, as a school leader, and if I, as a courageous, if you want to use that term, I don't think it's courageous, I just think it's the job we should be doing. But if I, as a manager of people, think it's okay to exclude anybody, then really I'm not worthy of that job. So the press can write what they want.
Good for you, Shaun. I do want to tease this out a little bit more, because the other day I had invited a friend of mine to watch the show, because he was running the D&I agenda in Indonesia, and he said, "Oh no, we can't. It's too controversial." So while even though it's not illegal to be gay in Indonesia, it's just such a controversial topic, I don't want to talk about it. So I was thinking, right, how must you have felt? I mean, at the time when you were about to tackle this, because of course, the benefit of hindsight, it went well, right? You had a lot of support, but you had no idea before you did that was going to happen. What advice would you give people like my friend who knows they have to tackle it, but are trying to find the courage to do it?
I mean, I'm not going to lie to you. It was frightening. You know, it was a frightening time. I mean, you know, my husband's in the room, and he'll tell you that Christmas, when I first wrote the training program, Inclusion for All, the night before I delivered that first in my own school, I was really anxious and didn't get a lot of sleep. But also because we got data in our school which showed that level of homophobic bullying. If you imagine that data had been about racism, we of course would have used a range of diverse role models, including people of color, because that's how you tackle it, that's how you prevent it. But as it was pertaining to homophobic bullying, the obvious thing to do was then use LGBT plus role models. And we actually had one in the school, i.e. me, that at that point wasn't out at school. So as well as delivering the training, I also planned to come out to my whole school community. So not only did I have the fear around delivering the training, I had the fear around coming out into a whole school community, which I knew then would ripple out into the community beyond the school gates. But I take you back to that data. Our children were suffering, and not just the children who identified as LGBT plus, but children who just didn't happen to fit in some way, and they were being singled out, because prejudice-related bullying can affect anybody. So really at its core, what I was doing and what we were doing as a school was merely being kind and compassionate and wanting to reduce suffering. And when I work overseas, which I do a lot now, that's really my starting point. I'm not here to wave a flag with a rainbow on it, although that's important too. What I'm here to do is to wave a flag with children on it, young people, families, members of staff, because they all deserve to be safe, included, and fully themselves in the workplace or at school. And what I find when I go and work overseas in territories where perhaps the political or school system is less favorable to this work, what I have to do is kind of find a point of reference. And that point of reference serves as my entry point. And often that's based around compassion and reducing suffering, and finding parallels between the experience of being bullied for being LGBT plus, or simply being perceived to be LGBT plus, and being bullied and targeted, for example, for being a person of color or having a different faith or a disability, whatever it is, or just the way you look or talk. You know, all of those things can single us out as different, can't they, and become a target.
Shaun, I mean, yeah, there's so much wisdom there. I just wanted to come back to the story you shared with us already about your coming out assembly, because I see a lot of chat on Twitter and I see a lot in the press when gay members of staff do come out, like it is a big deal. And I can remember working with a colleague at my last school who had never felt safe enough in any institution to be openly out about her sexuality, and she felt like it was the time when she could share it. And what I learned as a straight woman was that, like, you have to constantly come out. You don't come out once and then everyone knows your identification. It's a constant thing. Every time you meet a new person, every time you go to a new school, take on a new line manager. So is there any advice or wisdom there for people listening about how you can support people who are considering coming out in a school, or if you are that person who's thinking about when is the most appropriate time? Because I think a lot of early career teachers are much more open about their sexuality because they've grown up in a different generation. And I'm seeing them asking on Twitter, like, at what point in the next few weeks do I tell the staff, the parents and the students who I am?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm always I get asked this question a lot, and I'm always loath to give a kind of one-size-fits-all answer to it, because everybody is different and every school context is different. I mean, I guess the first thing to flag up is just the Equality Act. You know, in this country we are at the moment blessed with an Equality Act which says that sexual orientation, gender identity are protected characteristics, and as school leaders we have a duty of care to reduce elimination, foster good relationships and ensure that nobody is discriminated against. And from my point of view, if we're creating a school culture in which people are forced to lie about a core aspect of their being, we are not meeting the requirements of the Equality Act, and that's a fact. That said, I don't believe that we should be forcing anybody that enters the education system who identifies as LGBT plus to come out to serve as a role model, because they might not want to serve as an LGBT plus role model. It's not for everybody and it brings challenges with it. But also, I'm 52 years old. Somebody look surprised at that, please. I'm 52 years old, and thank you. And in my 52 years on planet Earth, every LGBT plus individual that I've met has a story to tell about their life, but also their journey as an LGBT plus person. And unfortunately, in many cases, not everybody, but in many cases, something keeps coming up, and that something is trauma. The trauma of living your life as an LGBT plus person in a world and in an education system that is often hostile. And those of us that identify as LGBT plus going into schools to work ourselves can sometimes bring that trauma with us. So we need to be at a place in our lives where we are grounded, where perhaps we have worked through that trauma, and then make an informed decision about whether or not it's the right time to come out or not. Now, in an ideal world, there should be no issue about coming out. We shouldn't have to come out. If you think about my primary school that I worked in, for example, when you started the new term, teachers would often come in and say, what did we do in the summer? And children would share things, and the teacher would go, oh, by the way, can I tell you something? I got married. And they would show a photo of their wedding or their honeymoon, and all the children go, oh, isn't that lovely? You went to Disneyland or whatever. But you know, I hear from LGBT plus teachers that get married who never reveal that information in schools. And I just think that's terribly sad. If we lived and worked in an education system where there was true equality, people wouldn't have to come out. We could just all be open and authentic from the first point of entry, and that's how it should be. But unfortunately, it isn't. So to the school leaders, if any school leaders and managers are listening out there, A, please don't force anybody to come out if they're not ready. B, if somebody comes to see you and says, I'm thinking of coming out, remember the requirements of the Equality Act, but actually just be kind. Be a compassionate listener. Talk to that individual about what their needs are and what their fears are and what support they might need, and unequivocally support them and love them, because then they will be happier in their work, then they will be more productive, and that leads to better outcomes for our young people.
I want a connected question, because I do find that it's not just in education. I do have a few gay friends in other professions, right, that it seems like it's really hard to come out or they came out when they retired, but not when they're in the middle of their profession, across professions, doctors, lawyers, people in corporate, across the board. So there must be, beyond personal trauma that prevents a person to come out, there must, what is the system, or what is it about context that also is the discrimination that you get that prevents a lot of professionals coming out? What is that about? And I'm asking this question because for allies or the rest of us who want to help create that space, what do we do? So this is why I'm asking the question.
So I think I'm glad you've raised the issue of allies, because I think that's hugely important. And whether it's a school or a business, there is a perception amongst some people that if we stand up for LGBT plus people, that somehow we're kind of identifying ourselves as LGBT plus people, and that's not true at all. You don't have to be LGBT plus to stand up for what's kind and what's right. And if you think about any organization, if it's not visibly inclusive, so if it doesn't have inclusive policies, if it doesn't have inclusive HR systems, if it doesn't use, for example, a role model program across the organization that celebrates and represents a range of diverse identities, if it doesn't send those visible, clear, open messages that it's okay to be absolutely you in that organization without compromise, then subconsciously, on a day-to-day basis, people start to pick up on those cues, and it starts to make them feel not welcome, makes them feel othered, and it makes them feel unsafe within that organization. So it's that sense of psychological belonging. And if we don't have that sense of psychological belonging, whether we're a young person in a school or a teacher in a school or a manager in the city of London, we don't have that sense of psychological belonging. We invest emotional energy into hiding or lying, essentially. We're taught to lie by our schools and workplaces. And that energy, if that was revealed, if that was released through authentic workplaces that are safe and inclusive, that energy can then be plowed into better outcomes for children and better outcomes for business. It's as simple as that. And it's about being kind, and it's about basic human rights. And it's interesting how often the term LGBT plus agenda gets thrown about. I mean, I'd love to know what that is. It sounds like a little packet of something that you'd buy from Aldi. Other shops are available. For me, this isn't about an LGBT plus agenda. This is just about basic human kindness and basic human rights. And it's certainly not about putting LGBT plus people on a hierarchy above everybody else in a school or an organization. It's about putting us all on an even playing field, because that's what equality is, isn't it? I think. Call me old-fashioned.
I want to just pick up on allyship, and I want to come back to lots of what you just said there, but I've seen something in the press in the last week, I'm sure you've seen it too, that one of the train companies has created the first LGBT friendly train company train ride, and there's been quite a lot of criticism on social media about it being performative allyship. What are your thoughts on that as a kind of a campaign that they're almost trying to make it visible that it's a safe space to be, but is that a little bit too over the top?
Yeah, I've got to be careful what I say, because one of my friends works on that train. So morning, Ross. Yeah, I'm always in two minds when I see things like the Marks and Spencer's sandwich and the train. There's part of me that kind of goes, that's a bit much. What does that actually mean? But as you know, I work across a range of different territories and different countries. And, for example, recently I've been involved in a project across 8 European countries, 2 of which are Hungary and Poland, where rainbow flags are being taken down, hidden, burnt, etc., etc., etc. So if you compare that experience to seeing a train with a rainbow flag on it and some rainbow sandwiches in Marks and Spencer's, just sending a message, however kind of visual that is, I kind of have to check myself really and go, do you know what? Be grateful. Be grateful, Shaun, that you live in a country where those things are possible right now. And I stress right now, because for me, if any organization, if any company is going to come up with a rainbow sandwich or a rainbow train, that's fine. That's visibility. But I want to know what's going on in their HR policies. I want to know what's going on in their policies in terms of how inclusive and welcoming they are with members of the public, around all of the protected characteristics and the intersections within them. So visible stuff, I think, is great, and I think it's fine. I know it's not to everybody's taste, but it's what goes on underneath that. And also, if in the future, which I am starting to believe, sadly, is very possible, that there are more strategic challenges to our Equality Act, and things really do start to swing away from inclusion and the protected characteristics, we'll look back at the train and the sandwich and kind of think, my goodness, you know, these people used to send out visible messages, and now we're in a place of fear and oppression again. So I don't think we should take these things for granted too much, and I don't think we should take the space we're in right now for granted at all.
And that makes me think, I can remember reading an article several years ago, and I think it might have been in the Big Issue, and it was an article about South America and countries in South America where it had been illegal to be LGBTQI for a long time, and then there'd been a change in government policy where it had become permissible. So people had come out, but then the politics had changed again and it had become illegal again. But then everyone was out in that country, and there was just the kind of the victimization of those individuals who momentarily in time had felt safe in that space. So going back to that point you made about kind of like safe spaces and psychological belonging, I'm interested in this because ultimately what I'm hearing you say is like creating a safe space for one group of people gives permission for other groups to become safe as well. And could you just share the anecdote about when you came out in your school and the kind of the ripples that happened in your community as a result?
Sure, yeah. I mean, as I've indicated, that choice to come out in my own school was huge for me. And I also lived near the school, so it meant walking home through the community. So I kind of thought, I could be targeted online, but I could also be targeted in person, if you like. And after I did the coming out assembly, which wasn't really a coming out assembly at all, it was purely that I fed back the data about the homophobic bullying. I fed it back to students, along with the other issues that were raised, excuse me. And they were able to see that homophobic bullying in language and the use of the word "it's okay" particularly was a problem. And we had a discussion around that. And part of that discussion was, what would the impact of this pejorative language and behavior be on someone who identified as LGBT+? Who do we know that's LGBT+? And that organically led me then to be able to go, and by the way, I'm gay myself. And yeah, I've experienced this stuff. And interestingly, one of the London radio stations rang me and tried to make out that I'd put on Kylie Minogue records and all of this stuff. And excuse me, just a second. And done a big rainbow flag pride assembly. And it wasn't that at all. But the impact of that was really interesting. Sorry, must have swallowed a fly. The next day, some parents asked to see me. And immediately my kind of anxiety kicked in, and I thought, my goodness me, they're out for blood. But over the next day and the next week, a number of parents came to see me, and they said, we are so pleased that you have sent a clear message to this school community that whoever you are, it's okay to be you, because we identify as, for example, Muslim. And by sending a message out that everybody is welcome in this school, we now feel a greater sense of psychological belonging, and we know it's okay to be who we are. And indeed, a number of staff came. I'll never forget it, actually. They came to me quite emotional, they were, and said, what you've done makes us feel that we can bring our whole selves to work. And we now feel that we can talk about our own trauma and work through that. We can now talk about the bullying we experienced at school, for example. We now feel that we can talk about our faith in a way that we can educate others. And it just continued to ripple out. And if, in a nutshell, I could kind of encapsulate the impact of that work that we did back in 2009-10, we created an authentic school community, and it was utterly beautiful and utterly joyful, and I will carry it with me forever. It was wonderful. It benefited everybody, and that's the point for me with this work. Yes, I get labeled as an LGBT+ advocate, whatever, but I'm just a compassionate human being, I hope. I'm just a manager trying to do my job, and a school leader trying to do my job, and that means making everybody feel safe and welcome. And if I can make one person safe and welcome and get it absolutely right for that person, that is going to benefit everybody within our school community. And that's the kind of school community that I would want to send my children to if I have them. Benefits for all.
I mean, that, yes, in that ripple effect, really important. We had a guest previously, Rodora, who's a D&I strategist, and she would often say, you start with the hardest one, because once you tackle the hardest one, everything else becomes easier, because people will begin to think, oh, if that's allowed, maybe this is allowed. And it really opens doors, doesn't it? Now, I want to go back to a comment you made earlier. You said, right now. Right now, this is what it is. So I want to ask you about how your work evolved over the years. So, because you started in 2009, it's been 11 years. You know, is the prognosis good? Is it getting better, you think? I mean, how has it evolved?
I forgot how to unmute myself, sorry. It's Sunday morning. That's a really good question. I guess the first year of the work was very much kind of a pilot version of it. Although it was, you know, when I sat down and wrote it, it was based upon my experiences as a class teacher, but also as a young gay man and all the experiences that I'd grown up with, and also listening to those of other LGBT plus people. But it was also written from a management point of view, a leadership point of view. And I was also working, I don't think I said this, as well as being a school leader and a class teacher, I also did a 2-day-a-week secondment across Southwark schools as a school improvement advisor. So for me, it was very much about taking the skills and strategies that I'd learned in those roles and then applying them to the data around homophobic bullying and piloting it. And over the first year, of course, other teachers in the school and other members of staff, they contributed to it. So it's very much, the whole program of work that I use is very much rooted in teachers and classrooms. That's where it came from. You know, I'm not a consultant that comes in a suit and tells you what to do that's never been in a school. I just wouldn't feel right doing that. Over the years, what was very interesting was very early on in the delivery of our training, we started to deliver a termly training day in the school hall for anybody to come to that wanted to. And initially we pitched it for primary because that's really where our confidence lay, I suppose. But straight away, the first training day we had was half primary, half secondary. But interestingly, we also got people who'd read about our work in the press coming over from the City of London. And I said, are you in the right place? And they went, no, we've read about your work, and your work is about organizational and structural and cultural change in respect of diversity and inclusion. And at this point, we can't get any training around that. So we want to come as well. We also had police, we had NHS, social services, youth services, and it really showed me that there was a need for what we were doing. So it's continued to ripple out. I've trained around 67, I think, thousand education professionals alone in the UK. And really, I keep it, I mean, every version of it I do, it's bespoke to that organization. So I'll say, where are you at? What are your needs? And then I will adapt it accordingly. It's based around a process of personal, cultural, and organizational change, because I don't believe that you can go on to the organizational and cultural change until you've worked with the hearts and minds of every individual in that space. And interestingly, if you think about where we are with Black Lives Matter and decolonizing the curriculum in schools, for me, it's the same thing. You can sit and write a decolonized curriculum or whatever, but until you've actually worked with people's own prejudice and bias, which we've all got, I believe, until you work with that, the rest is not going to be as effective. And very early on, actually, in 2010, my school was visited by the DFE, by the Department for Education. We were contacted by Ofsted, Stonewall, Church of England, who contacted our school and said, how come you're doing this LGBT plus work in primary schools? And it seems to be going well. How come that's happening when it's hit problems before? And my answer to that was, well, I think it's because it's compassion based. And I think it's because it's benefits for all. It's to make the school a safer place for everybody. And that really showed me that, again, there was this need in these larger organizations to look at themselves and their own structures and behaviors. So actually what started as a very kind of bedroom project in one classroom and one school hall has then gone on to influence, for example, people like Show Racism, the Red Card, Kidscape, you name it, really. And it continues to evolve and change. So whatever's going on at that time, I keep my eye on current issues. I try and react and respond, not in a knee-jerk way, but I try to keep the training and the strategy current. But underneath that, there's a 6-tier process of personal, cultural, and organizational change that remains there as a spine, if you like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm interested to hear, Shaun, a bit more about, like, what are the factors or the variables or the conditions perhaps in that journey you've been on, about what accelerates the progress of this journey, this agenda, and what decelerates it? What's kind of held you back? Are there any examples of those kind of like factors perhaps?
Yeah, what's held me back? Nothing. I've not let it. Things have tried to hold me back, but I've never let it. That's not to say that there haven't been moments where my energy's dipped, or I've had to take a bit of time out. But I mean, I guess what you're really asking is what the barriers that I've faced are. So let me just think about that for a minute. I guess when I first came into this space, which I never expected to, I never imagined that one day I'd be stood in the garden of 10 Downing Street being given an award from a prime minister for being an LGBT plus advocate. I just never imagined doing that or planned to do that. And as I've said, for me, I come at this work from the point of view of as a manager and a school leader. So when I came out into the LGBT plus space with the lens of being a school leader, I was used to working in quite a collegiate way with other schools and with other education professionals. And what I encountered very early on, and I guess I was disappointed with it more than anything else. It didn't stop me, but I was disappointed by it and a bit hurt, if I'm honest, was some of the established LGBT organizations were very, I think they felt a bit threatened, if I'm honest. I think they felt a bit threatened. They were clearly competitive, which I'm not, I don't think. And that upset me, because I thought, if we work in that way, what we're doing is we're investing energy in kind of taking each other down. And this space is hard enough to be in as it is. And if new people are coming into the space with the aim of wanting to make children's lives better and workplaces safer, we should all be supporting them, not trying to take them down. So I found that really, really disappointing. And I've tried to, since that day, when I see, for example, when I see people coming into the space, for example, teachers who are out at school. When I first came out in my own school, the Times Educational Supplement contacted me and said, we can't find any other primary school leader in this country who's willing to come out in the press as gay. Will you? And it will be a cover thing, cover story. And I thought about it, and I thought, okay, think about the children in your school. Think about the role model you could be. Say yes. So I said yes. I was terrified, but I said yes. So they could only find one. I knew there were other out gay teachers. Of course there were, but they didn't want to talk to the press at that point. Now, if we jump forward to 2020, we've got people like LGBT TED, and they're on, other organizations for lots of out LGBT professionals. Now, I'm not going to claim ownership or saying that's because of me. Of course it's not. I might have played a part in it, and lots of other people did too. But that, to me, is not threatening. It's joyous, because that's what we're trying to achieve. And as far as I'm concerned, if there's 10, 20, 30 training organizations that are going into schools or businesses and workplaces to facilitate inclusion, brilliant, happy days. We're all singing the same song, but we're all singing complementary verses of it, if you like. So that was hard. And the other thing that is hard, the other thing that can provide resistance, of course, is all the stuff I grew up hearing in the playground being directed at you on social media, from within and without the LGBT plus community. targeted with hate, not being able to please everybody. That's hard. And if you think about my own consultancy, if I decide to advertise it on Facebook, I dread it, to be honest, because the minute you start advertising on Facebook now, you wake up every morning with comments calling you a paedophile, comments saying that you hate this person or you hate that person, or you're trying to achieve some agenda, when actually all you're doing is trying to keep people safe. So that's what I found hardest. And obviously I'm not an organization, I'm one person, so I don't have a kind of a well-being team or an HR team to back me up. It's myself, my husband, and the dog. So yeah, they both get lots of cuddles sometimes.
You've got us as well, Shaun. We're happy to be your wing women and to be your allies and your buddies, because I do hear that a lot about the individuals who are disrupting. Like, you are putting your head above the parapet, and you do open yourself up to perhaps more critique. And just two things to pick up there. You spoke about the kind of the territorialness, can't even say the word, the competitiveness, which I do see a lot. And I do think, like, just at the moment, there's been an explosion of individuals and organisations working on the race agenda. And there's definitely a piece there about there's enough space for us all to be working in this space. There are 32,770 schools in this country. There are, like, if there's 100 people working in this space, they can take 3,000 schools each. Like, come on, guys, like, there's a lot of space. But one of the barriers I want to speak to is faith, because I know that faith can be very problematic when it comes to sexuality in particular. And we've got a couple of people who are tweeting a bit of challenge today, and that's fine, because we're all entitled to our own perspectives and our own identities and cultural journeys. The countries we live in do shape, obviously, who we are. But I know that there's been quite a lot of high profile stuff about faith in this country in the last couple of years. I'm thinking about Sarah Hewitt-Clarkson and the head teacher in the Midlands who got a lot of backlash from her Muslim community. Can you speak a little bit about the intersection between faith and sexuality, and how we can perhaps work within communities that are faith-based in particular?
Yeah, of course. I think it's really interesting, the whole kind of subject of LGBT plus identity and faith, because I've been both in my life. I knew that I was gay for as long as that I've known I'm Shaun. I just always knew, because I always knew I was attracted to men, not women. It doesn't mean I don't like women. I love women, but it meant I was physically attracted to men. And that's just been a truth of my life. And nobody made me like that, except presumably my mum and dad, thank you very much, and nature. But I was also a Christian for quite a long time, actually. And I often reflect on those two experiences, and I think if somebody had taken me off planet Earth, put me on another planet, and I'd been born in the same way, this is my personal belief, I believe that I still would have emerged as gay. But unless I'd had my parents kind of exposing me to the Bible and Sunday school, I don't think I would have emerged as a Christian. And I think that's really interesting to reflect on. I'm not making any judgment on that, but that's the truth of my experience on planet Earth. Now, one of the great joys to me when I started my own work was very, very early on in it. As I said earlier, I was contacted by the Church of England. And the Church of England asked me to go and spend a day with members of Lambeth Palace, other dioceses from across London and across the country. And we all gathered together at Harrow School, and they were very honest with me. They said, we haven't really had these conversations about inclusion in schools, and particularly primary schools and faith schools, before, in terms of LGBT plus identities. And we're going to be honest with you, Shaun, we're nervous about it. We've got some anxiety about it. And I said, well, as an LGBT plus teacher coming into your space, I've got some anxieties too. And can I tell you about how some people in my church made me feel for being myself when I was growing up? Can I tell you how some people throughout my time on earth have used their faith to attack me and diminish my identity, and how that very nearly led me to vacate the planet? Let's talk about that. Not in a way that I was attacking them, but in a way that we could just be honest with each other and share those experiences. And for me, at the heart of the kind of perceived conflict between LGBT plus identities and those of faith is that we don't kind of drop into a stereotype where we think those two things have to do this. We have to keep honest with each other. We have to keep nuanced with each other. We have to be compassionate listeners with each other. And of course, there is an intersection between the LGBT plus and faith communities. You know, I work in a lot of faith schools. You know, my work was recommended by the Church of England. I'm in their Valuing All God's Children pack. I've spoken in a lot of Catholic schools. I've spoken in schools where Muslim children have come up to me at the end and gone, when you described your experiences of being bullied at school, Shaun, that nearly made you want to kill yourself, that's how we feel when people target us because of our Muslim faith and call us terrorists. So we know how that feels. So again, there's that compassionate intersection there. And what was interesting was the protesters outside Sarah's school in Birmingham. I spent some time amongst them, looking at what was on their banners and listening to what they were saying. And once again, it was stuff that I've been hearing ever since I've been on this planet. It's the same stuff. And I would say that the majority of it was rooted in a misunderstanding of what LGBT plus inclusion in education is. And for me, I guess that's my raison d'etre, my key skill, if you like, is when I go into any new organization, the first thing I do is invest a lot of time saying, this is what we are doing. It's being kind and compassionate, and it's about equality, dignity, respect, and human rights. This is what we are not doing. We are not here to try and magically turn people, particularly young people, LGBT plus, because I don't know how you do that anyway. It doesn't work like that. We're not here to recruit or to promote. What we are here to do is to educate, to inform, and to keep people safe. And if we create a school culture where it's okay to learn about LGBT plus identities, then we're also creating a school culture where it's okay to learn about your Christian faith, your Buddhist faith, your Muslim faith, or the faith you don't have yet. Does that make sense?
Yeah. This is a really tricky topic, isn't it? The intersection between LGBT, faith. At the end of the day, you know, I think it's about respecting, I guess, the positions and find a way where it's the same. So it's not a this or that, it's this and that, and live in that way of thinking, I think. But more on this topic with our next guest, because our next guest is actually a retired minister who came out to his congregation when he retired at 82. He wants to talk about the intersection between faith and sexuality. So next week, that would be the main topic. Now, we want to move to talking about your book, Ray. I called you Ray. Shaun, I mean, yeah, tell us more about the book. What inspired you to write it? Tell us more.
So the book, yeah, I was very lucky actually in that I was tweeted by another Hannah, actually, a Hannah at Bloomsbury, who very kindly said, we've been following your work. Would you be prepared to write a book for us? And I said yes. So yeah, I wrote a book, Celebrating Difference, a whole school approach to LGBT plus inclusion, which came out last year and was actually recommended in the UK Parliament even before it had come out. And it was recommended as part of the debate around relationships and sex education that are LGBT plus inclusive. Although I don't think my book's actually got anything to do with sex education, because you know, this is a point I just wanted to make as part of the last conversation, actually, is one of the barriers to LGBT plus inclusion in education, particularly in primary schools, is the fact that many people in the world define someone who is LGBT plus by what they may or may not do in bed or in their kitchen or wherever they choose to do it. So their perception is that when you start to talk about LGBT plus identities, for example, in a primary school, that somehow you're going to be immediately talking about gay sex, which is not the case. That's just silly and it's rubbish and let's throw it in the bin. But that suspicion sits in people, and it concerns them when they hear that children are reading a book about two kings, for example, in a primary school. But anyway, back to my book. Sorry, went off on a tangent there. So when I wrote the book, what I wanted to do was to capture my life story in the first chapter, my journey from being born gay, which is what I believe, to doing what I do now, to traveling around the world, helping schools and businesses and sometimes entire countries to make their education systems and workplaces LGBT plus inclusive. But the majority of the book is based around the 6-tier process of personal, cultural and organizational change, which should be sustainable beyond the life of one or two or a team of inspired people. It should be sustainable and it should be compassionate. So the book's structured around that, and it contains research, it contains reflective questions. It's got a heavy dose of meditation in it, because I'm not a lifelong meditator, but a long-term meditator. And for me, meditation sits at the very core of all of our responses and reactions to natural human diversity. And if we can learn to notice those and be present with them, we can then learn to minimize their impact upon the people around us. And I think that's something that we should be teaching our young people from the very beginning as well. The book also features case studies from schools, from organizations, from initial teacher training faculties, and from universities that I've worked with over the years, as well as anecdotal evidence. There's data in there, there's graphs, you name it really. And there's a lot of me in it, because that's what people will say. That, you know, when I started writing a book, I immediately went down the academic research route, and people went, stop, no, use your experience and use what's in here. And that's what I've tried to do. So it's a very easy read in one way in terms of the language used, but it's also quite an emotional and hopefully quite thought-provoking, challenging book as well.
And thanks, Shaun, for A, writing the book, but B, sharing your story within it, because you clearly lead with being a courageous, compassionate, authentic leadership. And I think by sharing your story, it perhaps makes it more accessible, because it's that humanistic, heart-based kind of approach to this work, isn't it? It's about the practice led by humans, not about the kind of the policies telling us as humans what we need to do. And I'm just interested about your thoughts about how your book can contribute to the coming academic year. We know we've had a turbulent time in education. We know that the kind of the pandemic and COVID has created a lot of conflict within the education system, and it's disrupted it. And I'm quite hopeful there's an opportunity to dismantle some of the things that we would probably agree are wrong with the education system. So what does September hold for you when it comes to education and perhaps diversity and inclusion as part of education?
Yeah, good question. It's interesting, isn't it? All of this time that we've all spent inside reflecting, and how many of us throughout that process were able to see with more clarity what's wrong with the world and wrong with our societies and wrong with our education systems. But how quickly, when we came back out again, did you start to see rubbish in the streets or read about people being attacked and stabbed? So on one hand, I had real hope that maybe this sending us to our rooms would have given us time to reflect and make some changes. But as we move forward, I'm not entirely convinced that we have learned from it. So I think, first of all, we need to really look at all of ourselves and think, what have we learned during the last few months that we can carry forward into our lives, our relationships and our workplaces? And my concern is that teachers, bless them, and educators and school leaders, my goodness me, the stress that they must be experiencing right now, it must be off the scale. And I'm concerned for their own well-being and mental health as they go back to work. Of course, I'm concerned about the well-being and mental health and the safety of young people as well. And that's so important, that kind of the trauma of this experience is met with compassion when people get back into school, and that mental health becomes a focus. That said, it's really important that the diversity, inclusion and the LGBT plus agenda doesn't fall away. And I know from being a school leader for many years that we have a lot on our plate, and it's very easy to look at something and go, well, that seems less important. But this isn't less important. One, we've got the phased introduction of LGBT plus inclusive sex and relationships education. But secondly, let's reflect again on that experience we've all just had of being isolated in lockdown. And I attended a Childline webinar recently, and it really alarmed me, because they have had an upswing in terms of young LGBT plus children and young people contacting them during lockdown. And the issues raised, I noted them down, so I'll just quickly read them through, because I think everybody needs to be aware of this. the effect of isolation, we're removing them from their normal support structures, has been very profound. So the school should, I believe, serve as an unequivocal protective factor for those who identify as LGBT plus or who are questioning. And of course, in many cases, that's been stripped away, as has the supportive peer group around them. Many young children have not been able to come out because they're frightened that if they come out at this point, they're stuck at home sometimes with parents that are hostile towards them. And in some cases, that might or could have led to them being put out on the streets during a pandemic. So children have almost had to repress and compress their authentic identity, which means they're living a lie. And that takes a toll. It takes a toll when you're a young person, and it takes a toll when you're an adult in a workplace and over a lifetime. That non-judgmental support that schools give, that's been lacking in a lot of cases. And they've had a lot more time to reflect on their own sexuality and their own gender identity and then go online. And by going online, they've encountered, some of them for the first time, the extreme hate and toxicity that exists online. So they've encountered that in isolation, in lockdown, and they've really not had the space, the protective space in which to go and talk that out with people who are there for them. So I do think for educators, for teachers and for parents, we need to keep that on our radar very high up at the moment, because they've got all of that on top of all the trauma that we've all experienced as well. So it's this extra layer of unpleasant stuff that schools need to be aware of. And the other thing that I would just mention is, to bring it back to your question actually, was what relevance is the book at this point? Well, there's going to be lots of resources, hopefully, and training around LGBT plus inclusive sex and relationships education. And that's great. But think about the space that goes into. If that goes into a learning community where the whole school ethos is not inclusive, where it's not thought about the individual responses of young people, parents and carers and staff to LGBT plus inclusion, then those resources around inclusive SRE are not going to be as effective. And I would pose you all a question now. When I first got that data in my own school in 2009 that said 75% of our primary school students were being bullied, and I wrote that training program, the first thing I did was sit down and write this question. So I'm going to pose it to everybody who's watching and listening now. When you were at school yourself, when you first arrived at school, whether it was in nursery or primary school, and throughout your time in secondary school, college, university, sixth form, all of that, where, when, and how did you learn about heterosexual lives, histories, identities, and experiences? Where, when, and how did you learn about heterosexual lives, histories, and experiences? Can any of my two fellow presenters answer that? Maybe even in one word.
Probably at nursery. Probably reading books and seeing displays, age 3.
Yeah. So that's a question that I pose when I'm training, and often it's answered with one word, and that word is everywhere. Everywhere, all of the time. And it's not labeled as heterosexual because it's considered to be the societal norm. It's heteronormative. But if we learn about heterosexual families, lives, histories, and identities and experiences in our learning communities everywhere, all of the time, and our Equality Act says that we shouldn't discriminate against people who are LGBT, where, when, and how should we be learning about LGBT plus identities, lives, histories, and experiences in our learning communities? Where, when, and how? Do you want to answer
that? Right. I want to. You really want me to answer that? Oh, no, you don't. You don't.
It needs to be everywhere, all of the time, because that's equality, isn't it?
Yes. When actually I'm thinking, when you were saying that, I was thinking about my friend my gay friend who has a daughter at school, and I was thinking about his experience as a parent, because not only is he dealing with his stuff, he's worried about his daughter who gets bullied not because she's gay but because they are, and because nothing in education talks about families, her family, at least not in the Philippines where I come from. You think here is a problem. Can you imagine how it's like over there? So yes, absolutely. I wanted to ask you more about mental health. Like when you were talking about the stuff that we need to think about, I was already feeling oh heavy. I'm like, oh my goodness, all of that and this plus that. I mean, how the heck are you gonna deal with all of that? So I have two questions. The first one is, do you think that if schools come back and maybe focus on mental health, that somehow intersectional, it will cover some of the LGBT issues? Maybe if they could only choose one topic, would that be enough? That's the first question. And the second one is, well, you've been doing this now for a long time, and I'm sure that you have had to deal with a lot of barriers. It must have been, really difficult sometimes, even though I know you're like, go for it. How what can you recommend to people who are like feeling a little bit overwhelmed? Is there any tip that you can give them just to help them get through it?
Yeah, I'm going to answer those round the other way, if that's all right. So I'll talk about myself first. For me, my meditation helps. So it enabled me to notice when I'm starting to go into negative numbers, and then step back and take time out. And I had to go and learn about self-compassion and self-care, which I think is really important for everybody to do. Because my definitions of self-care prior to that were food and wine, and they aren't necessarily very healthy. So it's finding healthy ways to practice self-compassion and self-care. It's also my friends, my family, but really importantly for somebody like me that's above the parapet, it's important to take time off social media. And actually, I've changed the way I use social media over the years. I used to very much engage and talk to people online, but I've learned that you can't have nuanced conversations through social media. And sometimes people will spend an hour talking to you, apparently kindly and sanely, and then at the last minute they'll just have a go at you and call you a paedophile or just have just horrible stuff, and you've wasted an hour of your time. I'm not playing that game anymore. I use it to broadcast, and then I step away. So it's placing those boundaries in place yourself, really. But in terms of the schools and mental health, I think what we do have to be careful of is if there are schools that haven't had training around being LGBT plus inclusive, and there are still lots of schools that haven't, or if there is a school, and I don't want to stereotype faith schools, but from my experience, this is more likely to happen in some faith schools that haven't really started to address LGBT plus visibility. In terms of the mental health post-COVID, because they haven't really thought or don't want to think about LGBT plus identities and the experiences of young LGBT plus people, that could fall off the radar. So yes, there is an intersection between general mental health support strategies in school and the experiences of LGBT plus people during lockdown, but we can't and shouldn't assume that that's going to be on the radar of every school and every and every education professional, because it won't be. And that's a sad fact, but it should be, because that's kindness.
Right.
With our young people. And I believe that's why we all came into the profession, isn't it?
Yeah, I totally agree. And the question that Isa asked you there is actually the question I was going to ask myself, about the fact that we have an agenda about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have an agenda about mental health and well-being, and can we actually align these two agendas to integrate them? It's ultimately all about culture, ethos, and belonging, isn't it? And it's thinking about the different things we do to create safe spaces in our schools. And perhaps if we can look at the bigger picture of how these things all feed into our strategy and not look at them in isolation, that's going to unlock things, but also accelerate things further on. We've literally got 60 seconds, so we need to do a very, very quick wrap up. So I want one sentence from each of you. Isa, what is your takeaway from today's webcast?
Mine is, it's about belonging.
And Shaun, what's your one takeaway? What's your one pearl of wisdom for the audience?
Be kind, be safe, be proud, And whoever you are, wherever you are, be you, authentically you. That's your privilege. That's your right in your time on earth.
And I think mine is, Shaun, from what you said about the haters are going to hate, let them hate. Like, it's the commitment to the work needs to be done, and don't let the negatives pull you down. So Isa, I know you've mentioned already a little bit about who we've got joining us next Sunday. Could you just do an introduction to our 10th guest, please?
Fantastic. So our next guest is Ray Vincent. So Ray is a retired Baptist minister who is an advocate of same-sex marriage. He now works as a part-time chaplain in the University of South Wales. So the very first time he came out as a gay man to a church congregation was at the age of 80, after he retired. And can you imagine? So anyway, by 2019, he was named Stonewall's Gay Role Model of the Year. We are planning to talk to Ray about the theology and ethics of sexuality, the current situation in churches, staff networks, and higher education, and the experience of coming out in later in life. So a lovely, lovely man who has had a long life of stories. So yes, please join us when we speak to Ray next week. And thank you, Shaun, again for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.
It's been brilliant. Thank you so much for your time this morning, and looking forward to seeing the work you do this year. Take care, everyone. See you soon.
Love and light, everybody. Love and light.